Good evening all and welcome. This video has been graciously sponsored by Hunt a Killer, the company that create engaging and addictive murder mysteries, games, puzzles to solve and books. We've been playing the Mallory Rock mystery, where you get to be a detective. There's been a murder and it's up to you and your team to solve it. This involves sifting through piles of documents, evidence, audio recordings and case files, eliminating suspects as you go along to crack the case and catch the killer. It's a fully immersive experience with very high attention to the inbuilt universe that makes it all the more fun and feel incredibly real. It's definitely the kind of game you can play with your partner, friends, or family, and my wife and I have been playing for over 2 years now and love receiving our mysteries to get further into our cases. We're itching to actually receive the next part of ours, and I'm sure that once you've played, you will too. Follow the link in the description and punch in code MortisMedia to get $10 off your first purchase. You won't regret it. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I work as a backup janitor when the normal one is not available, and I've seen some very weird things at the places I've cleaned. There's the usual needles and beer cans. That's not shocking after a while, but the weirdest thing I have ever seen was when I was called out to a train yard to clean out some disused engines. These things hadn't been used since the mid-90s and were going to be sold for scrap as they were too battered to be refurbished. I was warned beforehand that there might be a bum in one of them, so I brushed it off since I'd seen many bums at the various places I cleaned. They usually just ran off when they saw me coming. So I picked up my bucket and got in the company truck to go out to the disused part of the yard where the trains were. Routine janitorial duties. As I'm driving out of there, I noticed that I left the keys to the train back at the office. Oh well, I figure. These things are so old that the doors might not even be there anymore. So I drive out to the engine and park my truck and get out. Nothing is creepy at this point, just some rotting diesel engines. I'd seen far worse. I walk up the railing and kick in the door with little force. It didn't even have a lock anymore. I walk in and immediately notice something very odd. It's in near mint condition. Great, I think. One less room to clean, but then I notice something very, very disturbing. A skeleton perched against a wall. Then I notice it's wearing a leather jacket and clutching a pill bottle in its bony hands. It was a suicide. I walk a bit closer and grab the pill bottle from its hand. The prescription date was from 10/9/96. This guy had been rotting in a train for nearly 20 years, and no one had noticed his absence. I pressed the button on my radio and told the guard to call the cops, that there's a dead guy in there and he's been in there for a while. About 5 minutes later, a cop car pulls up and an off-duty cop steps out and walks up to the train. Turns out the man had been missing since 1997 and no one cared enough to look for him. He was an elderly man who lost his wife and offed himself in a train, and laid there for years and was never disturbed. When they buried him a few days later, I was the only one to come. All of his family were dead or didn't care enough to come. Sad and creepy. I was on a training course in a fairly remote part of Africa. My buddy and I decided to go on a day trip to the city to see the sights. We went to some bars, a few clubs, and were warned that the trains were too dangerous for foreigners, but we didn't have any other means of transport. It was a long way away, so we took one anyway. We're both fairly big guys, and felt that ultimately we could handle ourselves. We had a good day, and ended up getting the train back at around 10 or 11. We were the only people in the carriage, and about half an hour goes by when 5 or 6 very thuggish-looking chaps boarded and began roaming up and down the carriages, and eventually come and sit down near to us. One of them in particular comes and sits in a seat directly opposite but facing me, and as he sits down, he stares at me and slips a knife into his waistband. Now at this point I was concerned, But I also had a knife on my belt and pepper spray in my pocket, so I decided to address the situation head on. I smiled at him and gestured towards the knife and said, "Hey brother, I see you have a knife there. What is it for?" He was a little taken aback by this, pulls out the knife and waves it around a little and stammers, This is to cut my bread." It was definitely not a knife for cutting bread. It was short and non-serrated, and a distinctly pointed end. I pulled out my folding knife from my belt and replied, Yes, I also have a knife. This one I use to butter my bread." At this point, his eyes light up when he sees my folding pocket knife. "Hey, that's a nice knife, can I see it?" And without waiting for an answer, he comes over and sits down beside me. I then joke that I can't let him see my knife unless he gives me his. So we do this little awkward exchange where we both kind of wave it around a bit, both scared to let go before we have the others. He admires my pocket knife and plays with it a bit. I look at his wooden-handed stabbing implement. The tip had really been crudely sharpened. Then we do another awkward exchange, this time joking around and laughing. We proceeded to have another 5 to 10 minute chat, and joking before he and his buddies got up, shook my hand and then left. It was a good feeling after the situation ended. I was pretty elated about being so close to getting robbed, but having turned it into something positive and humorous. That's when I checked my pockets and discovered my phone was missing. The guy used the distraction of the knife exchange to rob me. Just an old Nokia, but still. I have to hand it to him. I didn't feel a thing. And he kept up the patter the whole time. It was about as pleasant an experience as getting robbed ever can be. I'm a technical engineer. When I was working on my first job, I was on a test train, and we were in a normal operation heading towards the designated test site. All of a sudden, I see movement from the catwalk in the subway tunnel. The train operator gasps and slams on the emergency brakes, and the figure disappears as we pass the area where we saw it. After calling into control, the operator was already a mess, assuming he'd hit someone. He started by cursing up a storm, threw something nearby, then put his head into his hands. Control requested the exact station where we were and to confirm what we hit. So, terrified, I opened the door and peered down to the tracks. I see some blue jeans laying on the ground and remember thinking, wow, this guy was hit so hard his pants came off. And why is that blood so bright red? It looks fake. I just reported that I could only see pants and blood. We waited for the police to get there, and then my supervisor radios to the engineering team to leave the train from the back end, walk down the tunnel and exit at the nearest station. Later on, we found out that a man had actually taken his life, per the note found in the jeans, and was found in 2 pieces. I assume he was probably somehow pinned between the catwalk edge and then twisted and tore as the train passed by. It's a really horrible experience that makes me feel very unsettled whenever I think about it. The worst part is that I've found that most railroad workers have at least one such personal experience with a severely injured or killed co-worker, passenger, or trespasser. I do have another lighter story, to not leave on a downer. About 10 years ago, I was working on a train at around 3 in the morning, heading out to inspect a new communication cable installation along subway tunnels. These trains pass through stations and move, in general, very slowly. While passing a particularly busy station adjacent to a college campus, our crew was mocked, catcalled, and even flashed by a group of about 10 female students. One yelled out to a younger co-worker. The platforms where some of us were standing on were completely open, and blurted out her number, saying she expected a call when he was done. He wrote it down, and went ahead and called her at 4:30 when we were done. Left a message, and then met her the next night for drinks. Now, they're married. This happened around 5 years ago, the day after Black Friday. I was working later than usual because retail life, I made plans to walk home from work with my 2 guy friends since we all live together and work for the same company about a mile away from each other. Fortunately, I was able to get a ride from a co-worker to the train station where I was going to meet my friends, avoiding the almost mile walk to the train station through a drug-riddled and crime-heavy area. When I arrived at the station, I texted my 2 friends that I was there and that I was going to wait on the platform since I didn't want to loiter outside on the street so late at night. They said they were finishing up and would meet me on the platform soon. Once underground on the platform, I leaned against a wall and just generally looked around and watched people, since I didn't like being on my phone in very crowded places. It was past 11:30 p.m, but the place was still packed with Black Friday shoppers finally heading home for the day. Trains were becoming less and less frequent, and I was getting a bit annoyed that my friends weren't there yet, since each train was about 15 minutes apart. Finally, one was arriving in 5 minutes, and my friends texted me that they were on their way and would hopefully make the next train. I started lining up, expecting to make the next train coming, when someone behind me put their hand on my shoulders. I turned with a smile on my face, assuming it was one of my friends, but I was wrong. It was an older man in his 60s, about 3 to 4 inches taller than me, with a bulky, scruffy beard, wearing wrinkled, neutral-tone clothes. Naturally, my smile began to slip, but he had already caught my friendly disposition and took advantage, releasing my shoulder and standing so close to me that I took a few steps back from where I had started lining up and ended up next to the wall that I had originally been leaning against earlier. He reached out his hand for a shake, and on autopilot I stuck out mine as well. He clasped my hand with both of his, all the while smiling and saying, "Hello, what's your name?" I was caught off guard and not necessarily worried, just annoyed with myself for allowing this interaction to begin. I responded with a half-hearted, "Amanda." He didn't let go of my hand. Never dropping the smile, he goes, "Amanda, you're beautiful. How was your Thanksgiving?" At this point, I'd yanked my hand back and stuck both of them in my pockets. Where I live, stuff like this occasionally happens, so I've become better at dealing with it and giving non-committal answers that hopefully won't encourage nor anger someone who may be unstable. "Good, thanks." I stopped making eye contact and looked around, trying to see if I saw the train or my friends coming. Unfortunately, the man was not deterred. He started cupping my elbows in my hand, asking me more questions about where I came from, where I live, where I was going, what I was doing. I'm generally a nice person and didn't know how to stop the conversation. I did see 2 guys notice what was happening, and when I made eye contact with them, they both looked away like they hadn't noticed my situation. Finally, the train was approaching. My friends hadn't made it yet, but I didn't care. I was praying that this man was getting on the train. As it started pulling in, the man goes, "Is this your train?" I tell him, "No, I'm waiting for friends," which he definitely thought was probably a line I was feeding him, but no matter. "Let's take it together, come on." The man, still holding my elbow in his hand, begins to gently tug me towards the train. I keep saying, "Sorry, it's not my train, I'm waiting for friends." "This isn't my train." I begin freaking out. How is this happening in real life? The train stops and the doors open. People begin pouring out, and once they're out, people start pushing in. The man is tugging me harder towards the open door. "This isn't my train." I'm yanking my arm away, but he's now gripping it solidly, and unfathomably, I'm trying not to make a scene. Probably because I'm in shock. So I start to move towards the doors against my will. I'm starting to think maybe I'll just get on the train and jump off at the next stop. I'll text my friends to meet me there. I'll pretend someone's calling me. I'll sit next to someone else, anything. And then the greatest thing in my life happened. I hear my friends shout, "Amanda!" My friend had arrived at the platform and saw from a distance some random guy holding on to me. I yanked my arm away from the man who had loosened his grip when he saw that I really did have friends, and darted to them as the stranger jumped on the train as the doors closed. As it pulled away, my friends asked me who the man was, and I just began to cry. I had definitely almost complacently gotten on a train with a stranger because I was too afraid to say no and make a scene. My initially bewildered friends gave me a hug after I told them what happened and vowed not to be late again, just as I vowed not to let anyone ever drag me onto a train. Me and my best friend, who were both 22-year-old females at the time, have just spent 3 months backpacking in Europe. We had lots of strange encounters, but this one takes the cake. We had checked out of our hostel and decided to make our way to the international train station to wait for our night train. We had to take 1 or 2 trains to get to the big train station from where we'd been staying. It was in a relatively isolated area, with just highways and a gas station nearby. We preferred to get to the train stations or airports early to get our tickets and to make sure we don't miss the train. Also, we don't like walking around with our bags for hours. We had a 5-hour wait for the train, so we were both sitting on a bench just passing time on our phones. Around an hour after we arrived at the train station, a police officer came up to us and asked us what we were doing. I politely explained that we were waiting to board the night train, and he asked to see our tickets, and I said we don't have them, just our rail passes. He looked at our passes and told us we still needed to buy tickets. I thought he meant reservations, as some trains require pass holders to pay a reservation fee, though I had researched the train that we were catching and it didn't require as such. He told us to come with him, so we gathered our bags and followed him to the ticket office. He told the clerk that we wanted to purchase 2 tickets to Bucharest. I explained that we didn't need tickets and that our final destination was Budapest. He didn't listen and kept insisting to purchase tickets. Finally, the lady in the ticket office looked at our passes and printed something out like a seat assignment that seemed to satisfy him. The officer told us we needed to wait in a different area since we were catching the night train, so he took us to a closed-off room with some chairs and said we should stay there. He left, and we both breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the interaction was over. It was really scary being in a foreign country and having police officers yell at you. We thought we might get stuck in Turkey. We started watching a movie on my laptop to pass the time. About an hour after, we were in the new waiting room, and the same officer comes in and tells us that we have to move again. He says to follow him, so we do, and he starts asking us questions like what we're doing in Turkey and how we know each other, questions any border control would ask. He escorts us back to the outside bench we'd been sitting on originally, and asks to see our passports and tickets for the second time, so we show him. He points out which terminal our trains will leave from, and he stands by us asking us questions for a few more minutes, then leaves. This happens 2 or 3 more times. He comes and tells us we had to move and asks the same questions and looks at our passports. At this point, we're getting scared that we're going to be detained and not make our train. It's nearly time to board, so we decide to head over to the terminal. On our way there, he intercepts us as we are about to get to the escalator. He grabs my arm hard and I look at my friend horrified. He tells my friend, "You go on," and points to the escalator. She gets on the escalator. I mean, what else could she do when an officer with a gun gives an order? He waits until she gets a bit away, all the while gripping my arm, looks at me and says, "Are you on Instagram?" I'm stunned, tell him I am, give him my Instagram username, which he asks I type into his phone. He lets go of my arm and wishes me a good day. I reconnect with my friend, and we run to get on the train to find our seats. I'm in tears at this point. The whole day has been so scary. I thought we were being flagged as suspicious for getting on the train station too early. All the while it was just some creep trying to chat me up, using his police officer status and the fact that he was holding a gun the whole time to either impress or intimidate us, I'm not really sure. He followed me on Insta and sent me a message request along the lines of, "What's up, remember me?" Safe to say I blocked him straight away. My friend asked me why I gave him my Instagram at all, and I told her I just wanted the interaction to be over and for him to let me board the train. I can't believe I got harassed by a cop for hours just to get on my Instagram. I mean, seriously, what a creep, taking advantage of his uniform. For context, at the time of this story I was a 21-year-old female that was solo backpacking in France and made a day trip out of Versailles from Paris. You have to take 2 separate trains to both get out there and get back. I got on my first train heading back from Versailles, and my phone was at an impressive 3% battery, so I put it into airplane mode and low power, but had my headphones in without anything playing to deter people from approaching me. John didn't care. He came over and sat beside me, speaking to me in French. I'd been walking around the gardens all day and wasn't really in the mood to entertain anyone, so I pretended I didn't speak French. He pulled out his phone and went on to Google Translate, asking if I wanted to learn French. I responded with, "No thanks," and went to put my headphones back in to appear even more uninterested, since my body language wasn't enough for him. He continued to ask me questions through his phone, the next one being, "Where are you sleeping?" I lied and said that I was in a large hotel with my family and was heading back to them. He asked where it was, and I said, "Paris." He then asked if I was getting off at a specific stop of the subway, to which I said yes, another lie, and he said that he'd go off with me. I immediately said no and ended the conversation. I got my headphones in and completely closed him off from talking to me, which prompted him to leave me alone for a few minutes. He then got a phone call and said to his friend, "Yeah, I'll get off at X stop and you go to Y stop." This set off the danger alarms in my head, because Y stop is actually the stop where I was getting off. We get to the transfer station, and he got up and off the train and waited for me at the doors. I took my sweet-ass time getting up and made sure I had everything, to the point that it was very obvious I was doing it on purpose. He then left to get on the other train, and I slowly made my way to the next one, painfully slowly. I got on the train at the very front and was watching everyone around me to make sure nobody was being suspicious or watching me, to the point that they all probably thought I was on something. Well, we got to stop X, and I'm watching people getting off and coming on, as well as anyone on the platform, but I see no signs of him or anyone paying me such attention. We get to stop Y, and I depart with the crowd, turn the corner, and he's there with 4 people scanning everyone coming out. I turned around so fast and went the opposite way, taking my hair out of my bun and trying to change my appearance as much as possible. As soon as I got out of the train station, I ran back to my hostel and refused to leave unless it was with one of my roommates. The thing is, in Europe, human trafficking, especially of young women, is not something that's unheard of, and I've heard stories. So it's better to be safe than sorry. Who knows? If I'd have gone with him to meet his friends, it could have been the last thing I ever did. My uncle was on a through freight train heading home when they passed a pasture. Apparently a cow had escaped the fenced-in pasture and made its way onto the tracks. Now, a lot of animals, for some reason, if they are running from a train, will run directly in the middle of the tracks instead of stepping off it. This cow took a sprint in front of the train as the engineer blew the horn and tried his best to slow it down. It was a losing battle, though, as the train gradually overcame the cow. The coupler on the front of the engine lifted the cow by its arse and rolled it under the engine. As the now dead cow tumbled under the engine and the following cars, some part of it caused an air hose separation. This caused the train to apply its emergency brakes. Once the emergency brakes are applied, a conductor has to walk around the whole train to inspect it. So my uncle, being the conductor, hopped down to inspect the now gore-covered train to find the air hose separation. About 4 cars back, he found the separation, and coupled the hoses back together. As he looked up from the hoses, he noticed the tail of the cow hanging down from one of the knuckles. My uncle, being kind of a gross ass, thought it would be funny to bring the tail up to show his engineer, so he grabbed the tail and pulled a little to dislodge it from the knuckle, and attached to the tail comes what he calls a meat donut, which is of course the cow's butthole. At night, I was coming home from a friend's. To get back faster, I went on the railroad that goes through the woods to save time. I knew the place very well, and I heard a train coming. The railroad was vibrating, which is normal when the train is coming. I saw lights and moved away from the tracks to let it pass. But the train was almost transparent, barely visible. I was completely sober. I could feel the wind, hear the sound, everything that was supposed to happen when you're standing 5 meters away from a moving train. But the train wasn't really there. It was weird, but not the first time I saw something inexplicable on those tracks. I don't know what it was. When I was a teenager, I was with some friends walking back to town after having a smoking session along the railroad tracks. We were talking about someone who had jumped in front of a train recently. They were joking and laughing about it. I was uncomfortable with the conversation and interjected, "No, that would be absolutely messed up if we saw someone jump in front of a train. Nothing about that would be cool." The conversation stopped. Later that night it was dark, and we have our smoke session again. But in town, still near the tracks, we watched 2 guys a bit older than us stop and wait for a freight train that was passing on the closest track. It passes and one guy is already going, isn't looking, and immediately gets run over by a commuter train coming into the station going the other way from the freight train. We all saw it. The train was going slowly as it was stopping in the station, and nothing about that situation was cool. Ted Smith owned a small holding in a remote village in South Lincolnshire, England. He was able to live quite comfortably from the fruits of his labours, but had always wanted just a little more land. Next to his acreage was a small field and 1.5 acres with a little mound in it. Ted felt this field would be very useful and would enable him to extend his holding with sufficient to give him, in his words, that extra bit. The trouble was that the land belonged to a family who lived in London and owned parcels of land all over the country, and had so far resisted all attempts to relinquish this innocuous piece of soil. Ted had given up all hope of enlarging his holdings and was concentrating his efforts on farming his existing soil and making a reasonable living from his vegetable crops. When a letter arrived one day explaining to him that if he still wanted to buy the adjoining land, the owners were interested in discussing the matter. Ted acted quickly, and in time a deal was concluded and he became the owner of 1.5 acres of grassland. After careful consideration, Ted decided to deep plough the land and prepare it for cultivation. One morning, Ted drove a tractor to plough into the field and commenced the job. The land was hard and compacted, but the plough carved through the earth cleanly, and Ted knew his labours would not be wasted. Suddenly he was aware that he was ploughing something other than earth. He stopped, switched the ignition off and climbed down. Turning around, he saw that he had actually uncovered a litter of bones. Good Lord, he thought, and wondered if he'd hit a graveyard. Upon further examination, the bones were very old, and the smell they exuded was particularly obnoxious. He decided to stop the operation and return home to discuss the find with his wife, Maureen, whose counsel had always made sense. She was adamant to leave them alone until someone who understands them has the site examined, and that perhaps they may be of value or something for a museum. He agreed and decided to go and discuss the matter with his pal Jim, who was the local signalman. For those of you who don't know, a signalman is an employee of the railway company who controls the points and signals from a signal box in order to control the movement of trains. Tim was very interested and liked a mystery. He was also very curious and begged Ted to allow him to have a look around. Their discussion was interrupted by the visit of Ted's Uncle Albert, at age 81, who had wisdom to offer, and he said that he had disturbed a burial site and that it was important to not disturb it further. That night, Ted and Jim met in the local pub to talk about the situation. Jim wanted to look at the site, and that they may uncover something valuable, maybe Roman or Saxon, as they were buried with treasure. Ted finished his drink and agreed, but do not tell anyone, otherwise the whole village will come and want a peek. The next morning Jim was free, and the two men stood looking at the bones. They definitely smelled, and Ted felt a shudder, something unpleasant about the whole affair, he thought. So, they took a dig and looked around the scattered bones to find anything of interest. The work was hard, the sweat ran off their brow, and they took great care when they were concentrating on a small area, trying hard not to tread on the bones. After a lot of work, they found a more or less intact skeleton. They found that they were not in fact looking at a human but an animal. Not a cow nor horse, but it looked a bit like a large dog. The head was large and flattened, resembling a Labrador retriever. They discussed it and agreed to take it to Dave the vet, that he know what it would be. In the meanwhile, Maureen, the wife, was getting onto the museum about bringing in an expert to have a look at it. Early the next morning, Jim was on duty in the signal box. He had the skull in a plastic bag ready to consult Dave Smith, the local vet, when his shift ended. During a lull in rail traffic, he opened the bag and had a good look at it. It was hideous and awesome. Must have been a large animal. The jaws were large and powerful. Jim shuddered and returned it to the bag. Somehow he kept thinking about the whole affair, and he wasn't sure anymore about the skull. Should he have moved it? When shift ended, Jim made his way to Dave's surgery. He examined the skull and sucked his teeth. Must have been something big. I'd say it was a dog, but very old. You should put it back up and cover it. No point disturbing the dead. He went home. He put the bag containing the skull in the shed with his bike. All the same, he found himself wondering about the strange animal, and almost as if he was under some strange influence. He couldn't get the events out of his mind. At lunch the next day, he went down to the pub hoping to meet Ted. After 2 pints, he felt a bit better, and Ted arrived. He didn't say much, but agreed that he'd had strange thoughts and wondered whether or not they were due to the normal depression or influence of the discovery. Both men felt better for the chat and company. They had discussed Dave the vet's opinion, and Ted asked, "By the way, where's the skull now?" Jim informed Ted, and that he would go and get it and put it back and cover it up until the museum guys come. Jim agreed, and later that afternoon, Jim arrived at Ted's house. "Did you take the bag out the shed, Ted?" Ted looked surprised. "No, I haven't had time." It was gone. That night, Jim was a bit happier and didn't think about the previous worries. He was busy and time was passing quickly. About 11 p.m. he was aware that the wind was getting up and was buffering the wooden signal box. The location of the box was remote, about 1.5 miles from the village, but the line was busy and the box controlled the junction, so any signalman had to have his wits about him. He was reading the daily newspaper and enjoying a cup of tea. The wind seemed to have dropped and everything was peaceful, when he was aware of a noise outside the box. Jim assumed someone was coming. He shivered and was about to turn to go inside when he saw no one. When he saw a shape. It was a large form. It appeared to be a black dog, with a malevolent gaze. He leapt back into the cabin and locked the door. He didn't want to go out after that. There was no more traffic on the line for the time being. He smoked incessantly until dawn lifted, and then he cautiously looked around. His relief came up the steps and asked if everything was all right. Jim said he was fine and went home. He had breakfast and then went into his shed and opened the door and was nearly knocked out by the overpowering smell. He began looking for the plastic bag but was gone. He couldn't find it and thought about it for a while. Uncle Albert often came to borrow various gardening tools. Perhaps he had taken it. Later, Jim cycled down to Uncle Albert's cottage near the railway line, but the old man wasn't him. He looked in the windows to see if he was around, but no one was there. That night the weather worsened. The wind blew up a gale and it poured. Jim heard noises on the steps, which he investigated, but no one was there. Then his next train was belled, and he accepted it into his section, setting the signals and such. As the diesel with its oil tank train slowly passed the box, he suddenly heard a noise outside. He looked out and there it was, the animal with the great yellow eyes and the epitome of evil in its gaze. He slammed the cabin door, only to hear the hurried application of train brakes. He could see the flashing tail lamp of the oil train which had stopped. Something had happened. He threw the signals to danger and belled the message on and tore down the steps. His lamp and red flag in hand, the guard of the oil train was running towards him. Tim shone his torch. The man's face was ashen. "An old man," he gasped, "threw himself under us." Tim ran to the scene. There, under one of the tankers, was the lifeless body of Uncle Albert, and clutched in his hand was a plastic bag containing the splintered remains of the animal's skull. Last summer, my boyfriend and I were camping on the beach with our dog on the bay in Pacific Northwest. There is a set of train tracks that runs along the edge of the water through town. Where we were camped was near a weeping willow tree at the bottom of a dead drop with the tracks about 45 to 50 feet above us. We had a fire going, and throughout the night we could hear a train coming and going every hour or so. It was close enough that you could almost feel it in the ground shaking the tracks. The wheels pumping and screeching and the whistle blowing loud enough that sometimes we would plug the dog's ears. At one point in the night, when the fire was starting to die down to luminescent coals, it was about 2 a.m. when we heard a train above us, the usual. There are blackberry bushes in this thick cluster right along the edge where the tracks run, so we could sort of see the train through the bushes, although not directly. The movement was visible, clear as day. There was the train, chugging along, plain as could be. As it went past one car at a time, it was like as soon as the last car went by, poof, it was gone. The train just flat out wasn't there anymore. Every time another train passed, we could hear it. We know the path the trains take well. I followed the water, which means about 2 minutes after passing us, we should have seen it again in the distance as it went along the water's edge. We heard all the other trains fade as they continued down the tracks, usually blaring their horns the entire time, because there are crosswalks and intersections, so all of the conductors make good use of their horns. But it was more than just the horns. Everything had stopped. The eerie silence that followed was almost startling from the pure shock of having something so real and unquestionable in front of us, just to have it disappear. It was a normal train, I thought. I had to have imagined it until my boyfriend looked up at me and said, "What the hell just happened?" He said exactly what I was thinking. For him, the creepiest part was the shock of silence because it was right there, and suddenly it was gone. Not a doubt in our mind. I've tried to think of explanations. It wasn't windy at all that night, so there's no chance that we just didn't hear it as it faded out. I'm interested to see what you guys think, though. Still can't really explain it away. I work in downtown Chicago and commute every day on the Metro Union Pacific North Line. I usually take the 5:21 p.m. train home, which used to be 5:10 before they made changes to the schedule, and my stop is Rogers Park. It's the second stop of the route. For those that don't know, Metro trains have a door in the middle of each car, with a small vestibule and doors going towards the front half of the car or the rear half of the car. I got onto the third car from the front of the train and sat next to the window on the left side, just 5 or 6 rows up from the vestibule. The vestibule has heavy sliding doors that open after you press a big black button panel. They usually take a few moments to open up after you've pressed the button. To the right and left of the vestibule door inside the car are stairs that go up to a single row of seats that line the top of both sides of the train car. Some cars have a toilet, but this one did not. We get to our first stop, Ravenswood. Hundreds of people, including a lady that had just been sitting next to me, depart the train. Because of the schedule changes, some trains have been eliminated, so there are a lot more people getting on and off them. It took a while before everyone departed the train at Ravenswood. A few people got on, and one of them sat next to me. The person that sat next to me was a man in his upper 50s wearing a grey business suit with a jacket and tie, carrying a large leather briefcase. The briefcase caught my eye because it was obviously very old. It looked like something you'd see a lawyer carrying around with all of his papers in it. I say that it was obviously very old because the leather was worn and cracked, and honestly it looked like something that had just come out of an antique shop. He sat down and appeared to be in a bit of a huff. Because I knew I was getting off at the next stop and only a few minutes away, I motioned towards my B pass, showing that I'm not going much further, and said to him, "I'm getting off next stop if you want to swap places." It's a pretty common courtesy in Metro, and I've never had anyone refuse. Without looking at me and in a curt tone of voice, he just said, "No, I don't." I turned back towards the book that I'm reading, thinking to myself, geez, fine, whatever, guy. 3 minutes later, the train is slowing down to my stop, and I reach up to grab my pass and begin returning it to my wallet. As I'm doing this, the briefcase jerk stands up quickly and turns to the right towards the vestibule where I'd entered. I stand up, put my wallet in my pocket, and then follow him into the aisle, wondering to myself where the guy was moving to. My first thought was that he didn't want to deal with letting me out of my seat, so he decided to shift to another open seat before we stopped. Makes sense. Except that when I get to the aisle and look around at the few rows between me and the vestibule, the guy isn't in any of them. Perhaps he went through the vestibule doors already and is getting off at Rogers Park as well. Perhaps he was just moving towards the doors to beat the crowds, but I look towards the vestibule, and the doors on both sides of the area are closed. As I said earlier, the doors are slow to open, but they are even slower to close, staying open for some time, maybe a full minute before they shut again. Besides the doors being closed, there were 2 people in the aisle between myself and the door, looking through the glass into the door. I can see the vestibule is full of people, and there are several people in the aisle in the rear half of the car waiting to get out behind the closed door. Okay, weird, I thought, but maybe he went up the stairs to sit in one of the solo seats above. Makes total sense. I look up at the second level, and they are mostly empty. It didn't appear he was in any of these places. I move forward towards the door. The 2 other people are still between me and the door, and I'm about to move far enough forward to see he wasn't standing anywhere. At this point, I could also see the entire vestibule was very clear. The train got to my stop, the doors opened, and we all poured out. I looked around and couldn't see him anywhere. I wonder if he was a ghost.